The rain in the alley was colder than death, but the twins in my arms were still warm, their tiny hearts beating a frantic rhythm against my chest. I was just a waitress, finishing a grueling double shift, my feet aching and my yellow uniform stained with grease, when I found him. He was slumped against the cold, wet brick, his life force bleeding out into the gutter. Yet he was still clutching two screaming infants to his chest with a terrifying, desperate grip. In the flickering neon light of the alley, I didn't notice the glint of the luxury gold watch or the intricate tattoos creeping up his neck, the symbols that marked him as the city's most feared man, a predator of the underworld. I didn't see a monster. I only saw a father who was losing his grip on life and a pair of newborns who wouldn't survive the night without help. My instincts took over. I used my apron to pressure his wounds and whispered promises of safety to the babies as the thunder drowned out their cries. I didn't know that by pulling them from the shadows, I was stepping into a literal war zone. I didn't know that the man I was saving was a mafia boss whose disappearance had already set the city on fire. As I helped him toward my small apartment, I was unaware that my simple act of kindness was about to become my most dangerous secret. By morning, the hunter would become the hunted, and I would be the only thing standing between the most powerful man in the city and the enemies who wanted him dead. Before I continue this story, please like and subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories. The rain in Seattle didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker, turning the asphalt of the back alleys into mirrors that reflected the neon rot of the city. Sloane pulled her thin trench coat tighter around her shivering frame, the fabric already heavy and useless against the biting Pacific wind. Her double shift at the diner had left her feet throbbing and her mind numb. But the ache in her chest, the one that had lived there for 6 months, was louder than the storm. It was a physical weight, a reminder of the car accident that had stolen her husband, Tom, and left her with nothing but crushing medical debt and empty arms that still instinctively reached for a child that wasn't there. She had taken the shortcut behind the stone estates, the fortresses of black marble and cold steel that perched on the cliffs like gargoyles. Usually, the silence of the high-security district was a relief, but tonight the air felt thick with a different kind of tension. Then she heard it. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the rhythmic thrum of the rain against the metal dumpsters. It was a cry, sharp, thin and desperate, a sound that bypassed Sloane's logic and went straight to the maternal instinct her body still refused to let go of. She stopped, her breath hitching in the cold air. The sound came again, doubled, 2 voices, small and panicked. Sloane turned the corner into a narrow alleyway where the light from a flickering street lamp barely reached. At first, she thought she was looking at a pile of discarded rags. Then the rags moved. A man was slumped against the wet brick, his legs splayed out across the slick pavement. He was dressed in a black silk shirt that was now saturated with a mixture of rainwater and something much darker. Even in his collapsed state, he looked like a fallen king, muscular, imposing, and terrifyingly out of place in the dirt. But it was what he was holding that stopped Sloane's heart. Clutched to his chest with a white-knuckled, trembling grip were 2 infants. They were wrapped in a single cashmere coat, their tiny faces red and twisted with the effort of their screams. The man's head was lolling back against the brick, his eyes half closed, but his arms remained a locked fortress around the babies. "Oh, God," Sloane whispered, dropping to her knees in the oily puddles. She didn't see the glint of the luxury gold watch that cost more than her apartment building. She didn't notice the intricate dark tattoos creeping up his neck, the symbols of the Mafia that made the entire city tremble. She didn't see the monster that the news warned about. She only saw a father who was losing his grip on life and two newborns who were turning blue in the cold. Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, her hand shaking as she reached out. The man's eyes snapped open. They were piercing, predatory gray, even through the haze of blood loss. For a split second, a terrifying rage flared in them, the instinct of a cornered wolf ready to tear a throat out. He tried to shift, to shield the babies further, but his strength failed. A low, guttural groan escaped his lips, and he sagged back against the wall. "Don't touch them," he rasped, his voice like grinding stones. "I'm not going to hurt them," Sloane said, her voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "I'm a mother. Well, I was. Please, they're freezing. You're bleeding out." She looked down at his side. The black silk was shredded, revealing a jagged wound that was pumping life out into the Seattle rain. He was dying right in front of her. "The doctors, no hope," the man muttered, his mind clearly drifting into delirium. "Starving. They won't eat." Sloane realized then that the babies weren't just cold, they were weak. Their cries were becoming thready. She looked at the man, Cassian, though she didn't know his name yet, and saw the sheer, soul-crushing desperation in his gaze. This man, who looked like he could buy nations, was on his knees, watching his children fade away. "I live 2 blocks from here," Sloane said, making a split-second decision that would break every rule of her safe, quiet life. "If you stay here, you all die. If you come with me, I can stop the bleeding. I can feed them." Cassian looked at her then, really looked at her. He saw the yellow diner uniform under her coat, the kindness in her eyes that didn't belong in this fortress of cold steel, and the raw honesty of a woman who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. With the last of his strength, he leaned towards her. "Save them, not me. Them." "I'm saving all of you," she countered. She stood up and hooked his heavy arm over her shoulder. He was a dead weight, nearly 6.5 feet of solid muscle and trauma, but Sloane found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She tucked the infants into the front of her own coat, using her body heat to shield them, and began the agonizingly slow trek towards her apartment. Every shadow in the alleyway seemed to stretch towards them like grasping hands. Sloane felt the grime of the city sticking to her skin, but she didn't look back. She didn't know that she was currently carrying the most wanted man in the criminal underworld. She didn't know that by morning, the Mafia would be ready to burn the world down looking for the bundle in her arms. As she reached the door to her cramped 4th-floor walk-up, the man's weight became too much. He slipped from her shoulder, collapsing onto the hallway carpet just inside her door. Sloane didn't panic. She moved with a practiced, hollow efficiency. She laid the babies on her bed, the first time that bed had held life in half a month, and turned back to the man. She pulled off her apron, the one still smelling of coffee and cheap syrup, and pressed it hard against the hole in his side. He let out a sharp, choked hiss of pain, his hand flying up to catch her wrist. His grip was like iron, even as his eyes rolled back in his head. "Who are you?" he choked out. Sloane looked at him, her face framed by the flickering light of her small kitchen. "I'm the person who isn't going to let you die tonight." She didn't see the way his eyes lingered on her, the start of a dangerous obsession that would eventually threaten to tear the city apart. She only saw the blood. As she worked to clean his wounds, the physical pain in her own chest, the throbbing pressure of a mother who still had milk for a child who was gone, began to ache with a new intensity. Her arms weren't empty anymore, and the monster on her floor was the only thing standing between her and the silence she had lived in for too long. The rain continued to lash against the window, but inside, the war zone had already begun. The morning light didn't break through the clouds. It merely bruised the sky a sickly shade of violet. Inside the cramped apartment, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, iron, and the sweet, milky breath of infants. Sloane sat in the wooden rocking chair, the only piece of furniture she hadn't been able to sell to cover Tom's final expenses, watching the man on her floor. Cassian was no longer the unconscious heap of silk and blood from the night before. He lay on her threadbare rug, his torso wrapped in the white linen Sloane had sacrificed from her linen closet. Even in sleep, his face was a mask of jagged tension. He looked like a statue of a fallen god, carved from obsidian and scarred by 1,000 battles. On the bed, the twins were finally still. The miracle that had saved them wasn't medicine or formula, it was the quiet, desperate intervention of a woman whose body still remembered how to be a mother. Sloane looked at her hands, still trembling. She had broken every rule of her life, stepping out of the shadows to offer herself as a lifeline to strangers. A sudden, sharp movement on the floor snapped her back to the present. Cassian's eyes flew open. There was no grogginess, no slow awakening. One moment he was still, the next he was a coiled spring. He bolted upright with a guttural snarl of pain, his hand instinctively flying to his waist for a weapon that wasn't there. His gray eyes, clouded with fever but sharp with lethal intent, scanned the room like a predator sensing a trap. "Where are you?" he rasped, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the window panes. "In my home," Sloane said, keeping her voice low and steady. She didn't stand up. She knew better to startle a wounded animal. "You're in the South District. You're safe." Cassian's gaze locked onto her. He took in the yellow diner uniform she hadn't yet changed out of, the dark circles under her eyes, and the sheer, defiant kindness in her expression. Then his eyes darted to the bed. "The boys," he choked out, the predatory edge in his voice instantly replaced by a raw, agonizing vulnerability. "They're sleeping," Sloane whispered. "They finally ate. They're warm, Cassian." The use of his name, which she had seen etched in a small, blood-stained locket in his pocket while cleaning his wounds, made him freeze. He slumped back against the base of her sofa, his face paling as the reality of his injuries caught up to him. He looked down at the bandages around his side, the work of someone who knew how to treat a wound with limited resources. "You saved us," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Why?" "Because the rain was cold and they were screaming, and because I know what it's like to watch the person you love slip away while you stand there helpless." Cassian studied her, a dangerous obsession beginning to flicker in the depths of his cold gray eyes. He was the head of the most feared organization in the city, a man who had learned that everyone had a price and every kindness was a transaction. Yet here was a woman who had asked for nothing while risking everything to pull him from the grime. The silence between them was shattered by the low buzz of a smartphone on the coffee table. It wasn't Sloane's. It was the sleek, encrypted device she had pulled from Cassian's pocket. The screen was lit up with hundreds of notifications. Cassian reached for it, his jaw tightening as he scrolled through the messages. His disappearance had triggered a war zone. The city was on fire. His own organization was ready to burn every block of Seattle just to find him. But there were darker ripples in the feed. A rival faction, those who had ambushed him in the alley, were already claiming he was dead, moving to seize his territory. "He think I'm a ghost," whispered Cassian, his grip on the phone tightening until his knuckles turned white. "If I step outside that door, the Obsidian Syndicate will tear this neighborhood apart just to get to me. And my enemies, they'll kill anyone who helped me." Sloane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty window. She knew it was dangerous, but hearing him say it made the criminal underworld feel like a physical weight pressing against her door. "I'm a ghost too, Cassian," Sloane said softly. "I've been drowning in debt and grief for months. Nobody looks at me. Nobody notices the waitress in the yellow dress. If you need to hide, you couldn't find a better place than a house full of shadows." Cassian looked around the room at the peeling wallpaper, the single photograph of Tom on the mantel, and the sheer emptiness of a life lived in the wake of tragedy. He saw that Sloane wasn't just a savior, she was a woman who had stepped out of the shadows because she had nothing left to lose. "I can't stay," he said, though his body betrayed him as he tried to stand and failed. "My men, they're not all loyal. Someone sold me out. If I call for a pickup, I might be inviting my executioner to your front door." "Then don't call," Sloane said, standing up and moving toward the small kitchenette. "Stay here, heal. Let me take care of the twins. You're a father before you're a boss, aren't you?" Cassian watched her move, his gaze intense and unreadable. He had spent his life surrounded by people who feared him or wanted to use him. He didn't know how to handle someone who saw the monster and offered a cup of tea instead of a plea for mercy. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I am the grime of this city, Sloane. I don't wash off." "I've spent 10 years scrubbing tables," she countered, turning to face him. "I'm not afraid of a little dirt." As she spoke, one of the twins began to stir on the bed, a soft whimper breaking the tension in the room. Before Sloane could move, Cassian was already dragging himself toward the bed, his face contorted with effort and love. He reached out a trembling, tattooed hand and gently stroked the infant's cheek. The contrast was jarring. The most dangerous man in the city, covered in the marks of a life of violence, looking at his child with a devotion that threatened to tear the underworld apart. "They are the only clean thing I have left," Cassian whispered. "Then we keep them clean," Sloane said, coming to stand beside him. Outside, the sound of a distant siren wailed through the streets, a reminder that the world was still searching for the man in her bedroom. The Obsidian Syndicate was out there, a shadow growing longer with every hour he remained missing. But for now, in the quiet of a fourth-floor walk-up, the war was on pause. Sloane didn't know that she was the lifeline Silas, Cassian, needed to reclaim his throne. She didn't know that her dangerous secret was about to become the center of a revolution. She only knew that for the first time in 6 months, her arms weren't empty and the silence in her heart had finally been broken. The following days were a fever dream of domesticity and dread. Sloane moved through her tiny apartment like a ghost in her own life, her routine now dictated by the sharp, demanding cries of the twins and the heavy, silent presence of the man healing on her sofa. Cassian was a shadow that took up too much space, his large frame making her living room feel like a cage. Yet as he moved from the floor to the sofa, his predatory alertness began to soften into something more complex, a quiet, dangerous obsession with the woman who had transformed from a stranger into his children's guardian. The twins, Leo and Nico, had been a puzzle that even the most expensive specialists in the city couldn't solve. Back in the Stone Estates, surrounded by high security clearance and NDAs, the infants had refused every formula, every bottle, every attempt at comfort until they were fading, turning blue in their mahogany cribs. But in this cramped apartment, under the flickering light of Sloane's kitchen, a miracle had occurred. Sloane had offered herself, her patience, her warmth, and the biological secret her body still carried, breaking the rules of the household Cassian once ruled to save his heirs. "They're different with you," Cassian rasped one afternoon. He was sitting up now, his chest bare to allow the air to reach the jagged wounds Sloane kept meticulously clean. His dark tattoos seemed to pulse against his pale skin as he watched her rock Nico. "They were dying in that fortress. My money couldn't buy them a single night of peace. But here, they sleep." Sloane didn't look up from the infant's face. "Babies don't care about black marble or gold watches, Cassian. They care about the heartbeat. They care about feeling safe." Safe.
Cassian repeated, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. He looked at the door, the 3 deadbolts Sloane had installed after Tom died. You think they're safe here? My syndicate is tearing the city apart. The grime is slicker out there than it's ever been because I'm not there to hold the leash. If a single one of my enemies finds this door, this safety becomes a slaughterhouse. Sloane finally met his gaze. Her eyes were hard, tempered by the grief of losing Tom and the crushing weight of the medical debt that still sat on her kitchen table in a stack of red ink notices. Then don't let them find the door. You said you're a ghost. Stay dead until you're strong enough to be a monster again. A dark, appreciative smirk tugged at the corner of Cassian's mouth. He found himself mesmerized by her, this quiet lady who had stepped out of the shadows and hadn't flinched once at the blood or the reputation he carried. He had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted a piece of his power, but Sloane only wanted him to keep his children quiet so she could catch an hour of sleep before her next shift. As the days bled into a week, the bond between them grew in the silences. Sloane began to see the man behind the Obsidian Syndicate title. She saw him struggle to hold his sons with hands that were designed for violence, his touch so gentle it was almost painful to watch. She saw the way he looked at the photograph of Tom on the mantel, not with judgment, but with a strange, quiet envy for the man who had been loved by a woman like her. But the world outside was not resting. Through the cracked screen of Cassian's encrypted phone, the news was a constant stream of chaos. The Obsidian Dawn was indeed burning Seattle down. Fires in the docks, suspicious accidents in the financial district, and the rising price of security clearance all signaled a power vacuum that was being filled with blood. I have to go back soon, Cassian said one night, his voice cutting through the hum of the refrigerator. He was standing by the window, hidden behind the thick curtains Sloane had pinned shut. You have to bring the babies with me, he said, not meeting her gaze, his attention fixed on the orange coss-out outside in the street. You know what happened last time they were in that fortress. They were fading, Sloane argued, her voice a touch sharper than before. You can't take them back to the specialists who couldn't save them. Cassian turned, his face half shadowed. I'd take you with me, too. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. Sloane looked at her humble surroundings, the peeling wallpaper, the small television that only picked up 3 channels, the life she had built from the wreckage of her marriage. I'm a waitress, Cassian. I don't belong in a world of black marble and NDAs. You belong wherever those boys are, Cassian countered, taking a step toward her. The dangerous obsession was no longer a flicker, it was a flame. You saved the heirs to the city. You saved me. You think I'm just going to walk out that door and leave you to drown in this debt? You're the only person who hasn't tried to take something from me, Sloane. That makes you the most valuable thing I own. I am not something you own, Sloane snapped, her voice rising for the first time. Cassian reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was electric, a reminder of the monster who learned to love through the sheer force of her kindness. I know. That's why I'm asking. Stay in the shadows with me a little longer. Help me turn the grime back into gold. Before she could answer, the silence of the hallway outside was broken by a sound that made Cassian's entire body go rigid. It wasn't the rain, and it wasn't the neighbor's cat. It was the rhythmic, heavy tread of boots on the 4th-floor carpet, boots that didn't belong to a neighbor. Cassian's eyes went cold, the monster returning in an instant. He reached for the kitchen knife Sloane had used to cut bandages, his grip practiced and lethal. Get the babies, he whispered, his voice a ghost of a threat. Get in the bathroom, lock the door. Don't come out until you hear me say your name. The secret in the crib was no longer a secret. The war zone had finally reached her doorstep.
The heavy, rhythmic tread in the hallway wasn't the stumble of a drunk neighbor or the scuff of the mail carrier. It was the deliberate, weighted pace of men who moved with a purpose that didn't belong in a fourth-floor walk-up. Sloane stood frozen in the center of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The grime of the city felt like it was closing in, turning her sanctuary into a tomb. "The bathroom, now," Cassian commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. Sloane didn't argue. She scooped Leo and Nico from the crib, their small bodies warm and vulnerable against her chest. She retreated into the small windowless bathroom, clicking the lock into place. She sat on the edge of the tub, pulling the twins into the empty arms that had finally found their purpose, praying their silence would hold. Outside the thin door, the apartment was a silent war zone. In the living room, Cassian stood in the shadows, the kitchen knife held in a reverse grip. He was still weak, his side throbbing with every breath, but the monster had fully reclaimed its throne. The door groaned under a heavy shoulder. Once, twice. On the third hit, the frame splintered and two men in tactical gear burst into the room. They didn't find a dying man. They found the head of the Obsidian Syndicate. The struggle was visceral and short. Cassian moved with a jagged, desperate efficiency, using the tight quarters to his advantage. He didn't have his usual arsenal, but he had the dangerous obsession of a father protecting his blood. When the second man hit the floor, Cassian didn't stop. He pinned him against the peeling wallpaper, the knife edge drawing a thin line of red across the man's throat. "Who sent you?" Cassian hissed, his eyes reflecting the cold gray of the Seattle storm outside. The board," the man gasped, his eyes wide with the realization that the rumors of Cassian's death had been greatly exaggerated. "They said you were a ghost. They said the twins were leverage." Cassian's grip tightened. The grime of his world was slicker than he had imagined. His own board had turned, seeing his vulnerability as an opportunity. He silenced the man with a brutal blow and turned toward the bathroom door. "Sloane, it's me," he called out, his voice cracked with exhaustion. Sloane opened the door, her eyes darting to the unconscious men on her floor. The reality of the criminal underworld was no longer a story on the news. It was bleeding onto her rug. "We have to go," Cassian said, clutching his side where the wound had reopened. "My gold watch, the signal. They didn't just find us. They're tracking the movement of the Syndicate's assets. This neighborhood isn't a hiding place anymore. It's a target." Sloane looked at her small kitchen, the stack of medical debt, and the single photo of Tom. For 6 months she had been drowning, but this man, this monster, had given her a reason to swim. She grabbed her thin trench coat and a bag of supplies for the twins. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Into the shadows," Cassian replied, "to the places where the gold meets the grime." They moved through the back stairs, avoiding the main lobby where more of the Obsidian hunters might be waiting. The rain was coming down in sheets now, a torrential downpour that made the city look like a blurred charcoal sketch. Cassian led them to a blacked-out SUV parked 3 blocks away, a vehicle left there by a contact he still trusted. As they sped away from the only home Sloane had ever known, she looked back at the flickering lights of the South District. She was no longer just a quiet lady or a waitress in a yellow dress. She was the lifeline for a fallen king. "My debt," she whispered, the thought of the red-inked notices suddenly crossing her mind. Cassian looked at her, his hand reaching out to cover hers. His touch was no longer just a flicker of obsession, it was a promise. "Sloane, by the time this is over, the people you owe won't exist, and the gold in my vaults, it belongs to the woman who kept my sons breathing when the world gave up on them." They drove deeper into the industrial heart of the city, where the warehouses stood like rusted giants.
This was the territory where the syndicate ran its high-security clearance operations. Here, the grime was thickest, but the protection was absolute. As they pulled into a nondescript loading bay, Cassian turned to her. The feverish rage was gone, replaced by a cold, calculated focus. I am going to tear the underworld apart to find out who betrayed me. But first, I'm going to make sure you and the boys are untouchable. Sloane looked at the twins, sleeping soundly despite the chaos. She had stepped out of the shadows to save a life, and in doing so, she had walked into a fire. But as she looked at Cassian, the monster who learned to love, she realized she wasn't afraid of the heat. The war for the Obsidian Syndicate had officially begun, and the lady from the diner was now the most powerful piece on the board.
The loading bay of the Obsidian Syndicate's primary stronghold was a cavern of cold steel and flickering mercury vapor lights. As the heavy iron gates ground shut behind the SUV, the sound echoed like a tomb sealing shut. Sloane clutched the twins closer to her chest, her yellow diner uniform now a jarring splash of color against the monochromatic gray of Cassian's world. This wasn't the cozy, lived-in clutter of her apartment. This was a fortress where the grime of the streets was polished into a lethal corporate sheen. Cassian stepped out of the vehicle, his movements still stiff but carried by an aura of absolute authority that made the armed guards in the shadows instantly snap to attention. The monster had returned to his lair, and though he was wounded, his presence was enough to make the air in the room turn brittle. "Secure the perimeter," Cassian barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "No one enters this level without my direct biometric authorization. If a shadow moves without my permission, kill it." A man stepped forward from the darkness, tall, lean, and dressed in a suit that cost more than Sloane's medical debt 10 times over. His eyes were sharp, scanning the SUV before landing on Sloane with a mixture of suspicion and calculation. This was Marcus, the second in command who had been holding the syndicate's cracking lines while Cassian was a ghost. "You're alive," Marcus said, his voice devoid of the relief one might expect. "The board is in a frenzy, Cassian. They're calling for a vote of no confidence. They say a leader who can be vanished in a rain-slicked alley is a leader who has lost his edge." Cassian walked right into Marcus's space, his towering height forcing the younger man to tilt his head back. "The board can vote on the color of their coffins. I am the Obsidian, and until I say otherwise, my word is the only law this city recognizes." Marcus's gaze shifted to Sloane, who was standing by the open car door, trying to shield Leo and Nico from the cold draft of the warehouse. "And who is this? A witness? A liability?" "She is the reason your future hasn't been sold to the highest bidder," Cassian growled. "She is untouchable. If so much as a hair on her head is harmed, I will tear the underworld apart, starting with you." The inner sanctum of the syndicate was a maze of high-security clearance corridors and glass-walled rooms filled with servers and monitors tracking the city's pulse. Sloane felt like an alien species being examined under a microscope as they walked. The dangerous obsession Cassian felt for her was now public knowledge, a visible crack in his armor that his enemies were already looking to exploit. Cassian led her to a private suite, a fortress of black marble within the fortress. It was opulent, cold, and smelled of expensive leather and ozone. "Stay here," Cassian told her, his hand lingering on the doorframe. "Marcus will bring anything the boys need. I have to go to the boardroom. I have to show them that a ghost can still draw blood." "Cassian," Sloane called out as he turned to leave. She looked at the bloodstains still visible through the fresh bandages she had applied in the car. "Be careful. The grime in this building is different than the grime in the alley. It wears a suit." Cassian offered her a ghost of a smirk. "I know. In the alley, they stab you in the front. In here, they wait until you turn your back."
As the door hissed shut, Sloane found herself alone in a room that felt like a gilded cage. She laid the twins in a high-tech cradle that adjusted its temperature and rocking motion automatically, a far cry from the wooden chair in her apartment. She looked out the floor-to-ceiling window, which looked out over the churning Pacific. The rain in Seattle was still falling, but from this height it looked like mist. Hours passed. Sloane's mind raced through the shatters of her old life. She thought of her stack of debt, the empty diner, and the memory of Tom. She realized that by saving Cassian, she hadn't just saved a man, she had entered a war zone where kindness was a currency no one knew how to spend. The silent breach happened just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, turning the ocean into a sheet of hammered lead. It wasn't a loud explosion or a hail of gunfire. It was the sudden, eerie silence of the building's ventilation system cutting out. The lights flickered once, then shifted to a deep, alarming red. The high-security locks on her door emitted a mournful chirp and retracted. Sloane's heart leapt into her throat. She didn't have Cassian's training or Marcus's weapons. She only had her instincts. The loading bay of the Obsidian Syndicate's primary stronghold was a cavern of cold steel and flickering mercury vapor lights. As the heavy iron gates ground shut behind the SUV, the sound echoed like a tomb sealing shut. Sloane clutched the twins closer to her chest, her yellow diner uniform now a jarring splash of color against the monochromatic gray of Cassian's world. This wasn't the cozy, lived-in clutter of her apartment. This was a fortress where the grime of the streets was polished into a lethal corporate sheen. Cassian stepped out of the vehicle, his movements still stiff but carried by an aura of absolute authority that made the armed guards in the shadows instantly snap to attention. The monster had returned to his lair, and though he was wounded, his presence was enough to make the air in the room turn brittle. "Secure the perimeter," Cassian barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "No one enters this level without my direct biometric authorization. If a shadow moves without my permission, kill it." A man stepped forward from the darkness, tall, lean, and dressed in a suit that cost more than Sloane's medical debt 10 times over. His eyes were sharp, scanning the SUV before landing on Sloane with a mixture of suspicion and calculation. This was Marcus, the second in command who had been holding the syndicate's cracking lines while Cassian was a ghost. "You're alive," Marcus said, his voice devoid of the relief one might expect. "The board is in a frenzy, Cassian. They're calling for a vote of no confidence. They say a leader who can be vanished in a rain-slicked alley is a leader who has lost his edge." Cassian walked right into Marcus's space, his towering height forcing the younger man to tilt his head back. "The board can vote on the color of their coffins. I am the Obsidian, and until I say otherwise, my word is the only law this city recognizes." Marcus's gaze shifted to Sloane, who was standing by the open car door, trying to shield Leo and Nico from the cold draft of the warehouse. "And who is this? A witness? A liability?" "She is the reason your future hasn't been sold to the highest bidder," Cassian growled. "She is untouchable. If so much as a hair on her head is harmed, I will tear the underworld apart, starting with you." The inner sanctum of the syndicate was a maze of high-security clearance corridors and glass-walled rooms filled with servers and monitors tracking the city's pulse. Sloane felt like an alien species being examined under a microscope as they walked. The dangerous obsession Cassian felt for her was now public knowledge, a visible crack in his armor that his enemies were already looking to exploit. Cassian led her to a private suite, a fortress of black marble within the fortress. It was opulent, cold, and smelled of expensive leather and ozone. "Stay here," Cassian told her, his hand lingering on the doorframe. "Marcus will bring anything the boys need. I have to go to the boardroom. I have to show them that a ghost can still draw blood." "Cassian," Sloane called out as he turned to leave. She looked at the bloodstains still visible through the fresh bandages she had applied in the car. Be careful. The grime in this building is different than the grime in the alley. It wears a suit." Cassian offered her a ghost of a smirk. "I know. In the alley, they stab you in the front. In here, they wait until you turn your back." As the door hissed shut, Sloane found herself alone in a room that felt like a gilded cage. She laid the twins in a high-tech cradle that adjusted its temperature and rocking motion automatically, a far cry from the wooden chair in her apartment. She looked out the floor-to-ceiling window, which looked out over the churning Pacific. The rain in Seattle was still falling, but from this height it looked like mist. Hours passed. Sloane's mind raced through the shatters of her old life. She thought of her stack of debt, the empty diner, and the memory of Tom. She realized that by saving Cassian, she hadn't just saved a man, she had entered a war zone where kindness was a currency no one knew how to spend. The silent breach happened just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, turning the ocean into a sheet of hammered lead. It wasn't a loud explosion or a hail of gunfire. It was the sudden, eerie silence of the building's ventilation system cutting out. The lights flickered once, then shifted to a deep, alarming red. The high security locks on her door emitted a mournful chirp and retracted. Sloane's heart leapt into her throat. She didn't have Cassian's training or Marcus's weapons. She only had her instincts. She grabbed the twins, tucking them into a specialized carrier she had found in the suite's nursery, and moved towards the shadows behind a heavy marble desk. The door slid open. It wasn't Cassian. It was a group of 3 men, dressed in the same tactical gear as the hunters from her apartment. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace. "The boss wants..." The air inside the ventilation shaft was cold and tasted of ozone and recycled steel, a sharp contrast to the humid, rain-slicked alley where Sloane had first pulled Cassian from the brink of death. She moved with a silent, desperate grace, her knees scraping against the metal ducting as she balanced the twin infants against her chest. Below her, the boardroom with a theater of high-stakes betrayal. Through the narrow slats of the vent, she watched the obsidian syndicate fracture in real time. Cassian stood at the head of the obsidian table, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of a leather chair. His side was bleeding through his fresh shirt, a dark bloom of red marking the toll of his feverish rage. He looked every bit the monster, his presence vibrating with a lethal intensity that made the surrounding board members shrink into their expensive suits. But Sloane saw what they didn't, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted toward the door where he expected her to appear. His dangerous obsession was no longer a secret, it was a target painted on his chest. "I'll ask one more time," Cassian growled, his voice a low thunder that seemed to rattle the very vents Sloane hid within. "Who authorized the breach of my private suite?" Marcus stood 3 feet away, his expression a mask of practiced, unreadable neutrality. He adjusted his cufflinks, the gold catching the red emergency lighting. "Cassian, you're chasing ghosts. The security system suffered a glitch. We're all on edge because you've been out of the shadows for too long. Perhaps your judgment is clouded by external factors." Marcus's gaze drifted upward, momentarily locking with the dark line of the vent where Sloane held her breath. For a terrifying heartbeat, she thought he saw her. He knew she was the lifeline Cassian wouldn't leave behind. Sloane realized then that she couldn't just hide. The grime of this corporate fortress was slicker than any alleyway. Marcus was preparing to tear the underworld apart from the inside out. He wasn't just holding the line, he was moving the goalposts. If she didn't act, Cassian would be executed in the name of a no-confidence vote before the sun finished setting over the Pacific. She began to crawl back toward the junction, her mind racing. She needed a distraction, something that would break the silent breach and give Cassian the opening to see the monster standing right next to him. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the encrypted phone. It was still linked to the building's high security clearance protocols. She navigated the menus with trembling fingers. She didn't have Cassian's codes, but she remembered the emergency suppression swipe she had used in the suite. She looked for the boardroom sector. If she triggered the suppressant gas there, it would cause chaos, but it might also choke the infants. She needed something louder, something that screamed of a war zone. She found the fire alarm pressure release override. It was a failsafe designed to prevent the building from imploding during a catastrophic breach. If she triggered it, the pressure difference would blow the decorative glass partitions throughout the floor. Sloane took a deep breath, looked at Leo and Nico, who were miraculously quiet, as if they understood the dangerous stakes, and swiped. The sound was cataclysmic. A series of sharp, explosive cracks echoed through the floor as the glass walls of the boardroom shattered into a million diamond-like shards. The board members shrieked, diving under the table. In the sudden noise and dust, the monster moved. Cassian didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for Marcus. He had seen the way Marcus didn't flinch when the glass broke, the sign of a man who knew exactly what was coming. "You!" Cassian roared, pinning Marcus against the remaining frame of the window. "You sold the location of the twins to the hunters. You turned my own obsidian into a cage." "I did what was necessary," Marcus shouted back, his composure finally breaking. "You became weak, Cassian. You let a quiet lady from a diner dictate the future of the syndicate. You're not a king anymore. You're a liability." From the vent above, Sloane saw Marcus reach for a hidden blade in his sleeve, the twist she had feared. "Cassian, watch out!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the dust and chaos. She didn't wait for a response. She kicked out the vent cover, the metal grating crashing onto the obsidian table. With the twins strapped securely to her, she dropped from the ceiling, landing hard on the leather-bound surface. The board members scrambled away, terrified by the lady who stepped out of the shadows like a vengeful spirit. The distraction was enough. Cassian caught Marcus's wrist, the blade inches from his throat. The monster who learned to love didn't hesitate. With a brutal twist, he disarmed his second in command and sent him crashing through the gap where the window used to be. Marcus didn't scream as he fell toward the churning Pacific below. He was just another piece of grime washed away by the storm. Cassian turned toward the table, his chest heaving. He looked at Sloane, her yellow dress torn, her face covered in dust, but her eyes burning with a fierce protective light. He looked at his sons, safe in her arms. "You stayed," he whispered, the dangerous obsession now replaced by a profound, soul-deep gratitude. "I told you I'm not letting you die tonight or any other night." But the sacrifice wasn't over. The board members were still there, and the red lights were still flashing. The criminal underworld was still watching. Cassian looked at the men around the table, the ones who had stayed silent while Marcus plotted. "The Obsidian Syndicate is dead," Cassian announced, his voice carrying the finality of a funeral bell. "I am burning the world down, not in grief. I am burning it so something clean can grow. If you want to live, leave now. The gold is gone. Only the grime remains." He turned to Sloane, taking her hand in his. His grip was no longer iron, it was a lifeline. "We're leaving, Sloane, for good. No more fortresses, no more shadows." "Where will we go?" she asked. "Wherever the empty arms are full," he replied, looking at the twins. As they walked out of the shattered boardroom, the rain in Seattle finally began to let up. The monster had made his sacrifice. He had given up an empire to save a family. And the lady who stepped out of the shadows was no longer a waitress drowning in debt. She was the heart of a new dynasty, one built on the miracle of a chance encounter in a cold, dark alley.